If, else, and switch statements are essential tools that every programmer has to know. In programming, they're part of a group called conditionals. This video will go over concepts that apply to many different programming languages. However, we will be going over examples in Java. If statements. If statements work like this. If some condition is true, then run this specific code. Let's say we want to print out this line, "We are rich." This is how we would do it in Java, but we only want to print it on a specific occasion. In this case, let's say we only want to print it if our cache variable is greater than 300. Conceptually, it's something like this. If cache is greater than 300, then print out "We are rich." This is what we're trying to achieve. In Java, we would write it like this. Lowercase if, followed by a pair of parentheses, and inside we have our condition. In this case, that's cache is greater than 300. After that, we have a pair of curly braces, and inside of that we have the code we want to run, which in this case is printing "We are rich." Remember, the text inside the parentheses is called a condition. Conditions come in two forms. One, variables that store Boolean values, and two, code that returns Boolean values. For the first case, let's say we have a Boolean variable set to true. Now we'll make an if statement, if my value, then print my value is true. In this case, we only put in the variable name, and since the value of that variable is set to true, then this if statement will actually run. So it'll get to this point, read, okay, is my value set to true? Since it is, it'll end up going inside the if statement and read the code in there, which in this case will print my value is true, which you can see at the bottom output, my value is true. After completing the code in the if statement, it'll normally continue on to the code after it. On the other hand, if my value ended up being false, then when we run the if statement, it'll actually get to the if statement, check if my value is true. Since it's not true, it'll just skip everything inside and it'll output nothing because we skipped the print statement. For the second case of conditionals, we're talking about code that returns a Boolean value. In this case, we will need to use relational operators. Relational operators are used to compare two values and return one single Boolean value. Here are the main relational operators. First one is double equal sign. This means is equal to. Next one is not equal to, which is an exclamation point and then an equal sign. Then we have the less than sign, which of course means is less than, and the same with the greater than. After that, we also have is less than or equal to, as well as is greater than or equal to. Using these in examples, we can set an integer myInt equals 3, and we'll do an if statement, if myInt equals 3, using the equal sign that we mentioned earlier, then print out myInt is 3. As you can see here, since we're comparing the value of myInt to 3, and they are actually equal, it'll return a true value. So we'll actually go inside the if statement and print out myInt is 3. We can also do this with no variables at all. In this case, we have an if statement that compares two characters, a and b. We are stating if a does not equal b, then print out this line. Since, of course, the character a does not equal the character b, that expression will evaluate to true. And because that evaluates to true, the if statement will end up running, and we'll go inside the if statement, run the code in there, and then output a is not equal to b. Remember, if you want to compare strings, make sure to use the string function equals. For example, instead of writing string1 equals string 2, you would have to write string1 dot equals string2. This is a function of the string class. It's just how it works because you're trying to compare objects and not primitive data types like characters or ints. Else statements. Else statements can only come after an if statement. Conceptually, if the previous if statement does not run, then run code in the else statement. Let's say we have an integer called myInt and we set it to 4. And then we create an if statement saying if myInt equals 3, then print myInt is 3. Else, print myInt is not 3. So in this case, we would go through the if statement, see that it's false, so move on past it. Once we hit the else, since the previous if statement did not run, we'll end up going through it and it'll output myInt is not 3. Well, let's say myInt is actually set to 3. So now once we get to the if statement, since myInt does actually equal 3, then the expression in the if statement evaluates to true, so we do run the code inside the if statement, printing out myInt is 3. And after this, we end up skipping the entire else portion of the code because we ended up running the if statement. Else if. Else if is a very useful tool to chain if statements. Let's say we have a variable called myInt and it's set to 5. Then we create an if statement that says if myInt equals 3, then print out 3. That's what we said before. But then we'll also say else if myInt equals 5, then we print out myInt is 5. So it'll run through this code. Since the if statement is false, it'll end up skipping to the else. Once it gets to the else, it'll check the if statement there and see, okay, my int is 5, which is actually true, so that part will evaluate to true, and then we'll run the code inside, and output will be my int is 5. As you can see here, we can chain if statements and else if statements multiple times, which can be incredibly useful. However, they can also get kind of tedious. In order to make if statements with multiple conditions, we'll have to use logical operators. Logical operators are used to compare two conditions and return one single Boolean value. The different logical operators include AND, OR, and NOT. AND returns true if both of the conditions compared are true. OR returns true if at least one of the two conditions are true. NOT is the one logical operator that only takes one condition. NOT returns true if that one condition is false. Here's an example. Let's say we have an int called myInt and it's set to 5. Now we'll make an if statement. If myInt is greater than 3 and myInt is less than 6, then print out myInt is greater than 3 and less than 6. So since our value is 5, it actually does fit in that category, so we can go through and output the statement. Let's say we have two Boolean variables, myBool1 which is set to true and myBool2 which is set to false. Then we create an if statement that says if myBool1 or myBool2, and then inside we print out myBool1 or 2 is set to true. In this case, since we're using the OR operator, that expression will evaluate to true, even though myBool2 is set to false. Because myBool1 is set to true, we're actually still going to run the code inside the if statement, therefore outputting myBool1 or 2 is set to true. Let's say we have an integer called myInt that's set to 5, and then we have an if statement containing the NOT operator in front of a condition that says myInt equals 4. So this evaluates to myInt is not 4, essentially. Because our value is 5, when we put in myInt equals 4, that value ends up returning as false. Because that value is false, and we're using the NOT operator on false, then it returns true. So in this case, we end up going through this code and actually printing out myInt is not 4. Remember, you can nest conditional statements within each other. For example, you can say int x equals 10, if x is greater than 5, if x is less than 7, then print out x is greater than 5 and less than 7. And this is all within one big if statement and then a smaller if statement. You can nest as many if statements as you want, and this can be very useful. Switch statements. Let's say we want to print out the day of the week based on the integer day. This is stored in a variable called day, for example. Using if statements, we'd write it like this. Int day equals 3, if day equals 0, print out Monday. Else if day equals 1, print out Tuesday, and the list goes on for each of the days of the week. This can get a bit tedious and it's writing a lot of code, so this is where switch statements come in. Using a switch statement, we can write the same thing but make our lives a bit easier. First we start off with the word switch, followed by a pair of parentheses, and inside we put in our variable that's going to be tested. If that sounds a bit confusing, you'll probably understand by the end of this example. After that, in some curly braces, write the word case, and following that, write a value that could be an option for your variable. And after that value, write a colon. And on the next line, you write whatever you want the code to run, and then break. Break makes it so if one of the cases are true and we run through the code in there, then we end up leaving the entire switch statement after we're done with it. Next, we would say case 1 is equal to system.out.print Tuesday, and then break, and then the list goes on till we get to case 4, which is Friday, and then end it with curly braces. This is the same as an if statement, and it might look a bit longer, but it is much more simple to type, and it's much less repetitive. In this case, since day is 3, we're going to end up printing out Thursday. The values don't actually have to be integers, we can do it with strings or characters as well. In this example with strings, let's say our string day is actually set to Monday. So let's do switch day just like we did in the previous example, since day is our variable. But for each of the cases now, we put them to the day of the week in string format. So now we say case Monday and then system.printout 0 because it's the 0th day of the week. And after that, we're going to do the same case for every other day of the week. And after that, we're going to just end up printing out 0 since our variable does actually store Monday, so we're going to print out the code that's stored in the Monday case. There are two more small things to note. Let's say we have a variable called num and it's an integer and it's set to 4. We have a switch for that number. One thing you can do is you can make multiple cases run the same code. So in this case here, you can see there's no code after case 1, but there is code after case 2. This happens because case 1 has no code, it'll automatically default to the code inside the next case. This can work for even more than 2 cases. For example, if you had case 1, case 2, and case 3, and case 3 had some code, but case 1 and case 2 don't have any code, then case 1 and case 2 will all run with the code from case 3. In this case, if num is 1 or 2, then we're going to end up printing num is 1 or 2 and then breaking out of the switch statement. Additionally, we also have a keyword here that we can use called default. Default can be used at the end of a switch statement, essentially saying if none of the cases are true, run this code. So in this case we're saying if case 1, case 2, and case 3 don't run, then we're going to run default, which says print out num is not 1 or 2 or 3. And then end the switch statements. You don't need a break for this because it's the end of the switch statement anyway, so it's going to break out by default. In this case, the output is going to be num is not 1 or 2 or 3 because at the top you can see it's declared int num equals 4. If you want more tutorials like this, you can check out the channel and check out the playlist linked here. Thank you for watching.